Afternoon. It's Thursday, just after 1 o'clock. That means it's THCB gang time. I'm Matthew Holt, your host, founder and publisher of the healthcare blog, and we're going to dive into some big issues this week. It's been a hell of a week for the country, and we've got some healthcare specific stuff as well to talk about. All right, who's on today? I have three of my faves: Casey Quinlan from the Healthcare is Hilarious podcast at Mighty Casey on the interwebs. Jean-Luc Neptune, CEO of Suntra Modern Recovery, these days on his own podcast, Is It Serious? We'll talk a bit about that. And Mike Magee, medical historian, and Mike has a piece up yesterday, looking at data on the healthcare blog, and I know Casey's had some stuff to say about it as well. So that's where we are, and that's who we are. And hi, everybody. Let's have a quick smattering and go round. I assume there is one massively high topic on everybody's mind because of what happened in Texas this week. But let's kick it off. I want to start with you, JL.
So I think the thing that's most interesting, I think this happened in the last 24 hours, Sequoia, the legendary venture capital company, is officially calling an end to the good times. And they put out a deck, I think just yesterday. It hit the web and I'm only just reviewing it now. But the title is Adapt to Endure. And essentially they are predicting that we're going to see a severe market downturn that could last many, many, many months. And they are advising their startups as such. And it's very interesting. The flip in the switch is move from a position of growth without concern to building a profitable business that can grow based on its profitability. So I think the end times have come, at least for digital health funding. You know, we saw so many crazy rounds in the last few months, and I think we may be heading into a place where there's less exuberance or less irrational exuberance.
Yeah, someone mentioned in one of the Slack channels in one that Sequoia has now successfully predicted 9 out of the last 4 downturns in venture funding. They had a similar one in March 2020, which didn't last.
That's right.
And they said it, but the one they did in whenever it was late 2000, early 2001, when the Nasdaq fell by 80%, probably worth probably worth mentioning at that point. I mean, it was so great. Casey.
Yeah, well, I kept waiting for the Tulip Mania fog to clear, and it looks like somebody found the big fan, and a lot of this is getting blown away. All of the, as they said, irrational exuberance, and I'm old enough to have lived through a whole bunch of things, including I even remember the big oil crisis from the 70s as an adult. So, I've been waiting for this sort of crumbling to happen. I'm glad it has. I'm sorry for the people that are going to probably be taking it in the shorts here, but it will be interesting to see what arises / survives from this great Tulip Mania fog lift.
Absolutely. And we'll see. It's interesting how it's been happening in the public markets now for more than a year. The high heights are like in, end of 2020, and then early February, Teladoc started coming down. A bunch of other a bunch of stuff got out in the SPACs and started falling immediately. And finally, it has no doubt gone to the private markets. I talked to a venture capitalist about this just yesterday, and people are still getting funded, but it's about 3 times next year's sales, not 100 times next year's sales. And certainly it's going to be very interesting with those companies that have raised hundreds of millions that haven't got profitability yet. This is the point where I tell the audience that I am a teeny investor in JL's company, and I'm expecting a 100-fold return pretty much immediately. So I don't know what he's doing with his time on this show. Anyway. All right. Mike, are you going to talk about the elephant in the room?
Well, it does seem like we're entering a phase where you can expect the unexpected, right? That, today, for example, they first reported that used car sales are down for the first time in many months. And it wasn't expected. Came kind of out of nowhere. There's no good rational explanation for it, except for the fact that people decided to stop buying very expensive used cars. So, even with something like inflation worries, what they're warning is that you can expect the unexpected, that you might all of a sudden flip yourself into a recession, and don't be surprised if that should happen in any case, whatever's going to happen to the market, it seems like people have decided that health tech investment is going to be on the front end of whatever radical changes do occur. And so it's sort of, I'm sitting back and, most of the time I'm just reflecting and trying to connect dots. Certainly not an investor or someone who's trying to run one of these new startups. But I'm kind of glad to be on the sideline, because I do think we're going to face some rugged times. And beyond that, the societal challenges, from children being shot to monkey virus, I think are going to keep people more than occupied with things other than health tech in the near future.
Yeah, I'd agree to that. And I think, you raised the point. We can't not talk about this to some extent, right? Which is that we just had, nearly 10 years after Sandy Hook, we now had essentially the same. And
9.5 years. It was just before.
And when was Columbine? Columbine was on the
99. That was 99.
25 years ago, right? I mean, and as far as I can tell, what has happened since then? The country's been more flooded with guns, and we seem to have had. And then there was the point that's, Greg Abbott, who to me is like one of the lowest forms of humanity. And I'm with Beto calling him out to his face, that'll help him win the election or not in the fall, but came out and said, oh, it's all a mental health crisis. And it turned out he had cut mental health budget considerably in Texas. But we seem to have just completely given up on this. Whereas you look at, they'll go back to Australia or the UK or other countries where they've had this, where they've had either a school shooting or a big, somebody walking around with assault weapons and shooting people up, and they've come after the guns. And as Jim Jeffries in his famous, rant says, before the guns were taken away, we had 8 massacres. After that, we had none. Could be a coincidence. I don't know. So, and there is the other point, and Mike wrote about it on GCB this week. There is this issue, and Casey, you've been watching this for a long time, and we've actually talked about it on your podcast. There is the issue of, data and how data is being used. And the remarkable thing worth pointing out, I think, on the gun issue is that Congress has banned the Bureau of Arms, Tobacco and Firearms, the ATF, from actually recording data in like a computer. So literally, when they get data about guns, they have to somehow put it into microfiche. It's literally completely useless. And so, even if we did have, which we didn't, this 18-year-old and the previous 18-year-old in Buffalo who went to the black supermarket in a black part of town and started shooting up stuff with the N-word written on his gun and live streaming. I don't know if you call that mental illness or you call it vicious. Whatever's going on with these kids, and they are kids, right? Even if we had, information about their mental health and they've been in the system, which they probably weren't, how the hell that translates to preventing them getting access to weaponry, I don't even know. When you have a system which has no ability to share data because it's been congressionally mandated against it because of the NRA funding all these politicians over the years.
Speaking of the NRA, I'm sure that every one of us witnessed the it was like whiplash. How quickly it was apparent that the NRA had sprayed out coordinated talking points, because every, tweet after tweet after tweet after tweet from these NRA apologists came out horrified and heartbroken, horrified and heartbroken, horrified and heartbroken. Every single one of them used that phrase. And it's like, oh, coordinated messaging much? And that happened before we even found out that the cops had been outside the freaking school for more than an hour or maybe more before they even went in. And, meanwhile, this guy's like, shredding a classroom. I fail to see how any of this indicates that we're anything but a very lost bunch of souls as a nation. And then the mental health thing. Turn around and just blame the seriously mentally ill, who usually end up becoming victims of violence much more so than perpetrators.
Absolutely. Jael, I put you on the spot here, but you run a company which deals with a lot of people with one slice of mental illness. I don't know how it's easy to say somebody does something so horrific, right? They go to an elementary school and start shooting kids, and you got to go, well, that guy's crazy or whatever, or they go to a Walmart and start shooting people because they're Hispanic, or they go to they pick on a particular group again. Obviously, kids is like gut-wrenchingly emotional. I've noticed, quick sidebar, I've noticed in Casey Quinlan that at least Brightline and Headspace Health and maybe others have said they're gonna, do a thing on how to talk to your kids about it. And I went to an assembly yesterday morning, so after the shooting had happened at my kids' elementary school, and it didn't come up. And the teacher wrote to us and said it actually didn't get mentioned in the classroom. And they, these are 7, 8-year-olds. I mean, I don't know how much they're getting news. I didn't bring it up because I don't know what to say. And maybe these mental health companies will help us with some ideas. But my question, JL, is: are these people who do this kind of thing? I mean, is this actually mental health, or is this something that could be traced or dealt with in the mental health system anyway? I don't know. I don't know how you even think about it.
So I spent quite a bit of time on Twitter last night reading about this. I was actually probably up until like 2:00 last night because I was very troubled by this. And I ran across some data, or somebody who was commenting, a psychiatrist, who was saying that a very small percentage of the people who end up carrying out these attacks actually have a diagnosable DSM diagnosis before they actually commit the act. And if they do have a DSM diagnosis, it's a common one. It's anxiety, it's depression, it's a personality disorder. But, the truth is, like most of these people, often you don't really see it coming. For this young man who ended up shooting those children in Uvalde, I mean, his only indication to the world that he was going to do this was a Facebook post 30 minutes before he did it. Right. So I think part of the challenge here, and, I think there's some very clear obfuscation by gun proponents to pin this on mental illness. Yes, it's some kind of aberrant kind of behavior, but it's definitely not something that's really diagnosable beforehand, really not something predictable from all the stuff that I've read. And the truth is, Matthew, we do a lot of substance use work, but we also deal with a fair amount of severe mental illness, and obviously there's overlap between the two. We've had multiple cases of family members who've seen a young person in their family who's completely lost their mind, right? They've descended into schizophrenia or some kind of bipolar break or something like that. And, we spent a lot of time working with families to try to, I'll give you an example. We had a young man, very successful, worked at a tech company, was married, had a beautiful wife, and then all of a sudden started hearing voices and started believing that there was a government conspiracy against him. And, we spent months, 6 months or more, working with the family to try to get this guy into treatment. And the way the laws are written, certainly in New York State, I think maybe the laws are less progressive than we have, less progressive in other parts of the country. But unless this young man that I'm talking about said that he was going to kill himself or he was going to kill somebody else, there was nothing you could do to force him into treatment. And there was nothing you could even force him to do to be evaluated. And I think, part of the challenge here is that, even people who are showing aberrant behavior, the way our mental health infrastructure or the way we evaluate people, unless somebody is showing you that they have a gun, they have a plan, they're going to go kill somebody, there is really nothing that you can do about it. And, the truth is, looking at mental health as the solution, like we need to spend more money on mental health, I don't think that's the solution to the problem at all.
I mean,
yes, we do. But on the other side, that's not really the issue. Again, they're pointing, it's all a distraction. The distraction, I think, is some kind of, if you look at the history of the US, and look at some of the, sort of the cultural heroes that we've built over our 200 plus some years of being in existence as a country, is we've always had this sort of, like lone hero out there on the frontier with his gun. This is like our American prototype of the great American hero. And they all seem to be kind of scary dudes. And as far as I'm concerned, that's a big part of the problem in our myth making, is that we've held up this, sort of lone gunman as being an avatar of our best selves, but then every time he actually shows up as a lone gunman somewhere, he's killing people. And it's like, I'm sorry, what? How did this guy get to be a hero? And then all of a sudden, when he does show up, he kills people, and we can't come up with a solution. I think it's background checks, folks. And if you're under 30 years old, you don't get to buy anything that isn't a single shot, single pull. That's it. No automatic. I don't know why they're selling assault weapons to anybody in the commercial market.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, in some ways, I think we're just way too optimistic about human nature. I've always said that human beings are not as civilized as they appear to be, and that you have to treat them with caution, even more so for Americans, because we have this history of being highly weaponized, and also we have a history of massive racism and elimination of entire populations of people and manifest destiny. So, if human beings are relatively uncivilized in their national setups, we're a little bit even more so. Maybe not the worst in the world, but we're a setup for disaster. So the notion that someone like Trump would come along and take the cap off the crazies is, that's the point where somebody should have said, you can't do that, right? You cannot unleash the hounds, because once you do it, you can't get them back under control. And I think in some ways that's sort of where we are now. And we still haven't quite figured out how to walk this thing back. I mean, I think Biden is trying as best he can to sort of appeal to walking this thing back. But once it's out and once, you've got low cost ways of organizing and spreading propaganda and organizing the crazies, it's a hell of a mess to try in a civil society to figure out how to walk that back. But I agree with JL. I don't think mental health treatment is going to walk this thing back. I think you've got to literally reestablish quite a few checks and balances on the system. A guy like Abbott, he ought to lose office for what he's doing, but we haven't figured out how to do that yet. But we need to figure that out. We need to take the crazies and the crazy leaders and basically, lock them up or at least defang them.
And Matthew, an important thing to understand too is that we're saying this all in the context of an environment where most people, the majority of Americans, support some kind of restrictions, right? The majority of Americans realize like we have a problem. The majority of Americans realize like killing a classroom of 19 fourth graders is a problem. And most people support a range of different kind of policies, universal background checks, moving the purchase age for guns up to 21. There are a bunch of other things that have been considered. And I think, to me, what this really, the real problem is a corruption of our political system. I think we have senators who are essentially bought and paid for by a lobby that makes money by having more guns, spreading more fear, killing more people. And we're locked in this feedback cycle that we can't get out of. And until we can either demonstrate and shame these senators who seem to be shameless from what I can see, I don't know how we break out of this. Because again, if the NRA is willing to go out and spend literally tens of millions of dollars per senator to buy their vote, buy their silence, what more can you do? Because all it takes is one senator from a small state to say, hey, listen, we're not moving forward with any of this legislation. So I think we're trapped in a we're really seeing the limits of our political system to truly reflect the will of the people. And I think obviously, we have a broader issue with democracy that we've been dealing with, but this is a very specific instance of it where what people want is what's not happening in terms of legislation.
There's one person who's in charge of this country right now who's driving the entire legislative agenda, and that is Mitch McConnell.
Mitch McConnell, sure.
It's like this all lays at his feet. and he's like untouchable. Short of, I don't know, eating too many cheeseburgers or something. I mean, I don't know, it's like, how getting him out of there. I'm not sure how you're going to do that. And
the joke is he is the minority. That's the other. And
I mean, yes, but no.
January he may well be the majority leader again. I don't know what.
Yeah.
It's worth mentioning, if we're going to be conspiracy theorists, how do you do something about this? Well, I mean, I'm on record saying you should abolish states and abolish the Senate, but that's not going to happen, to be real. But you do have certain things. It's pretty clear the NRA, which has non-profit status, don't forget, like the churches. I mean, it doesn't deserve it, but like many churches doesn't deserve it, but was clearly taking a lot of Russian money and was heavily influenced. There was that Russian spy who was involved with it. And there's a lot of murky sort of criminality in the background. It's also clear as day evidence that both the Congress, Senate, and via then ATF is, there is STIeglers Theory of capture, which is a great political science theory, which is, the regulatory agency gets captured by the industry, and the industry of selling guns, you look at the numbers of guns that have been sold has gone through the roof. We're now at 120 guns for every 100 Americans.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, it's
insane. And as a byproduct, right? And this, I recall, I was interviewing the current Surgeon General, who I'm having an Alzheimer's.
Vivek Murthy.
Thank you, Vivek Murthy. Who the hell is he? Because he was the previous Surgeon General.
He's been around a while.
I interviewed him at Health 2.0. He came back right. I interviewed him at Health 2.0. Before he got there, when he was like a public health researcher at Harvard, he'd been going about guns as a public health menace. CDC was not allowed to
even do research.
Do research on it. And right when he came up for appointment, when the Senate was run by the Republicans, his appointment was held up and he squeaked through because of his proposal of doing research. And I got to interview him at Health 2.0 when he talked about some sort of public health stuff they were talking about in IT. And I was really physically manhandled by his people who said, don't ask him about gun legislation. He won't talk about that. He can't talk to me about guns and public health, even though he's done it. He just, so.
Yeah.
I went, well, okay, if that's where we are. But I mean, it seems to me that, as JL says,
I'm seeing him at the Academy Health annual research meeting in like a week and a half. So if I get a chance, I'll bring it up.
You should. I mean, I think the answer is, and this was I think maybe post Sandy Hook, but I mean, it's happening with such regularity.
Yeah, I think it was
today I saw some data.
I was there. I think it was in 2016.
Yeah, I think so. Today I saw some data that now guns are killing more children than auto accidents.
Well, here's one for you. More kids have been killed by going to school than cops have by being cops going to work.
Jesus.
Think about that.
That's awful. I mean, it's just like I said. I think it is, as JL says, it's a massive political problem, and we have I mean, I'm sure you poll people, the background checks. I mean, have you ever seen what happens if you want to buy a gun in Japan? There's like there's like a 6-month process. Somebody who was someone was running a restaurant and wanted to go and shoot rabbits or something, for their special dish or whatever it was. And they go to interview your neighbors and your friends. You have to do all this cycle. I mean, it's like, I'm with it. I think, the same thing is now true in the UK and all the rest of it. Now, we may not get there, but we can certainly...
We can get a little closer to it.
We can certainly agree that the background check stuff, some level of psychological evaluation, and for God's sake, who the frick needs a military-style weapon?
No, exactly. Jean-Luc is hot to talk.
But Matthew, the problem is our momentum is in the other direction, right? Because
Absolutely.
A variety of a number of states have actually loosened the requirements. So I've made it easier for people who have no training, no evidence that they know how to use a handgun safely, are able to carry, there's like concealed carry, that permitless concealed carry has been approved in many states. You have open carry in a lot of other states. I mean, like, I run this mental experiment in my head many times, right? Let's say you are a police officer in an open carry state. A guy's walking around with an AR-15. Maybe he's acting a little strangely. Like, is that guy going to shoot up the supermarket? Is that guy, you know, exercising his constitutional rights? Like, as a police officer, how do you handle people like that? And again, like, we've moved in a much more permissive way that makes me think that these kind of massacres are just going to become more common in places, at least where they're.
Well, they seem to be doing that. You know, the acceleration is alarming.
I had a conversation. I was at a dinner last night. And I had a conversation with some people. It was a bunch of young venture capitalists, actually. And instead of talking about the stuff JL raised to start, we started talking about political extremism. And they were saying, they were saying we're moderates and both sides are getting more and more extreme. And I said, well, yeah, no, but, you know, I don't, at least extremists on the left don't seem to be in charge of their party, whereas extremists on the right do seem to be. And they said, well, what are the extreme positions the Republicans have? And I was going, well, really, the only two I can come up with that are now, you've got to be in favor of the Republican Party now that weren't 20, 30 years ago, is immigration and guns, and maybe abortion, right? So there aren't these big policy issues like, you know, universal childcare, universal healthcare, all the stuff that the far left of the Democratic Party or further left of the Democratic Party is pushing, which isn't getting anywhere because of the Joe Manchins and the Kristen Sinema's of the world. And even Biden isn't, you know, taking it. But you know, whether or not the argument was right about how the extremists have captured one party versus the other, and whether it's whataboutism the same on each side, they're really, if you look at the sort of the nature of modern republicanism, it really is around sort of ideological cultural issues. And we've talked about masks and anti-vaxxing and whatever in the show in the past, and clearly we talked about you know, attitudes now to abortion and probably eventually gay marriage and birth control and God knows what else that's going to come back at us, and the long game that's been played by the right to change the Supreme Court. But it does seem that there are only a few, you know, big cultural issues that hold that wedge together, and guns just seems to be, you know,
that's the one,
you know, is a big one, right? And it's something about, you know, the Democrats are coming for your guns, and I think, you know, I'd be quite happy with the Democrats to come for their guns and everyone else's guns, but you know, you've got to think that that, as you said, JL, even though things have gone on the states where, especially those rural states, where it's more permissible, you know, you'd think some national legislation like around assault weapons like we had in the 90s, or background checks, or age limits, or cooling off periods where you could buy something. There's a bunch of stuff surely you could do that doesn't stop, you know, the good old boys going out and shooting the deer, you know, whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I am so many years old that I remember the fight over assault weapons ban back in the 90s, because I was still in the news business then. And I remember the fist fights and the, you know, just like how hard it was to get that passed at all. And then the only way it could get passed is with a 10-year sunset. And then by the time the 10 years came around, because I think it was like 94, and then we get to 04. By 04, we were all rah, Iraq invasion, all of, you know, everybody was like out there beating their chests. And I thought, well, I don't think that we're going to get anywhere, because everybody wants to be freaking, I don't know, you know, like John McClane or, you know, John Wayne or, you know, something. So, you know, it's like they want to have all their weapons. And so they're going to, and it gave the NRA 10 years to do a full-on assault on their loyal members and the people that they knew they could drive both to the polls and to the offices of their electeds, to say, no, if you do this, I won't vote for you. And, you know, and the NRA could threaten to cut off cash. So, you know, they had 10 years to lay that groundwork, and then they murdered it in its bed, basically, in 04. So, you know,
And Matthew, I'm interested in getting Mike's perspective on this, because I know he's talked about this before, but I think that there's an elephant in the room here, because your statement was the people are afraid that the Democrats are going to come and take our guns, right? I think there's a level below that now. I think we are at the stage of Democrats are going to take our guns so that we can be replaced, right? And I think that this whole replacement theory,
that's where the guns and the immigration thing come together. Yep.
I think there's a very strong intersection there, right? And I think that is, we're trying to have rational arguments about safety, right? About, I didn't realize that Mike was Dr. Mike until recently, but for guys like me and Dr. Magee, we think about this as a public health issue, and we're trying to have rational discussions about it, right? But I wonder, to some extent, is this are we dealing with such primitive, as Mike was saying, wild, untamed parts of the human psyche, that trying to have this rational prefrontal cortex debate is really a waste of time? Mike, I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
JL, one of the things I think most people don't realize, for both doctors and nurses, is that a lot of what we do, whether by virtue of touch or whether by virtue of personalizing the care, is to try to process fear and worry and try to reinforce the kind of bonds that people need for stability, whether through the community resources or whether through an extended family. So we're always kind of, not in a holier than thou way, trying to reassure people that everything's going to be okay, right? This morning, Meacham was on Morning Joe, and he was saying, at the core of this, you've got to find the right incentives to get people to do what they apparently don't want to do. And I think that's very relevant right at the moment, because if you look at the NRA, they're going under. Okay, so you can blame the NRA at this point, but at this point they're going under. Okay, and yet the politicians are still voicing these things as if the NRA has a gun to their head and saying, we're going to take away all your money. Well, they're not going to have any money. They're being sued to oblivion at this point. Okay, so the politicians are pretty much doing this on their own. So the question is, well, what would be their incentive for doing that? And the incentive is to make sure they get reelected into these posts that they apparently desperately want. They want to get reelected. That is at the core of their incentives. Now, why is it so important that they hold these jobs? Well, in America, capitalism basically says that we'll reward the people who have the money. So apparently, with the power of those roles comes money, and a lot of money. So what Meacham was basically saying is, okay, if those are the real incentives, you've got to figure out how to reward these people for doing what's right rather than doing what's wrong. And so I'm sort of thinking that that's what's going on here, that, whether it's abortion or whether it's watch out, they're coming across the borders to replace you, or whether it's you need your guns because that's what it is to be an American. These are all proxy issues for maintaining one's position as a politician and basically delivering the goods for those individuals. And the only way really to change things is you got to get those guys out. They got to somehow be voted out for this kind of massive misbehavior.
Yeah, I mean, well said, and it's hard to see in the current state of the way that we organize politics with the Senate. It's very hard to see how it happens. We still have, around 35% of Americans who identify as conservatives, who are, and the people within that group who seem to be more and more culturally affiliated with the, don't replace it. The joke about don't replace this, with immigration is that apparently all this activity in Buffalo, at least, was towards black people who I don't recall voluntarily immigrated in general. I mean, you're actually an exception to this.
Yes, black people did not come here voluntarily.
Wasn't a voluntary immigrant. Right. Not that every immigrant came in a very voluntary manner, given the people who were driven out of Russia and what have you. But anyway, all right. I think that's a healthy, it's a great discussion of a very unhealthy topic, and I'm hopeful that some, fingers crossed, something will change.
I'll go with thorough.
Well, it's a thorough discussion, right? Let's shift gears. I want to try and get to the two things. I mean, we talked a little bit at the start about the sort of the digital health sort of funding winter that's coming, but I think I'd like to touch base on is the data issue, because Mike just wrote about it. Casey has a lot of thoughts about this. We also on THCB had the oh Christ, help me! I'm having the brain days. Casey.
Well, that's what are you digging?
Sorry,
for?
I'm thinking about Hamish McDonald's.
Yes, the Sovereignty Network.
Thank you, the Sovereignty Network.
I've been typing sovereignty so much lately. I've actually gotten to the point where I can almost type it without having to backspace. So,
which worries me, because it sounds very much like this is a right winger Terre Blanche, South African.
Well,
it's not. It's nothing to do with that. It's around data ownership.
I will say that Hamish is a very white guy, so there's that.
He's a lovely, cute. He's a lovely, cute New Zealander. But I mean, this sort of came up right because Mike has a piece. There was a piece from Casey Ross in Stat. I know Andrea Downing, who you work with along the Light Collective.
Was that the root of that discussion? I'll put it that way. That went on between you and real briefly, I will say. So what happened was in the Stat piece, and I think Mike elaborated on this, is that IQVIA, which is the old IMS Health, which has for decades, and I'm talking back to the 80s, and in fact, Mike, you put this back on Sackler back in like the 40s, right? the guy before, I mean, Mike always puts this stuff in great historical context, has been talking about using data. And the data that's been used primarily has been identified data about physician prescribing behavior around, and that's been used very heavily by pharma companies forever to target physicians for promotions and to reward their sales teams. It's built into the compensation model of their sales teams, which is, as you know, 2/3 of the money in pharma goes to marketing and sales, a huge amount of advertising, direct detailing, et cetera, right? So that's going on forever. In the late 90s, early 2000s, I was involved in this a little bit. A number of companies started building patient data into this, primarily theoretically de-identified patient data. But what has been happening in the last 15 years or so is that techniques have been developed to take quote unquote de-identified data and then taking that data and matching from different data sets, but using various techniques. One is called tokenization, where you take the identifiers like name, address, whatever, you convert them into some strings so they can't be theoretically re-identified, but you do Matthew Holt in this one database, Matthew Holt in another database, make sure it's the same Matthew Holt, slam it together, and you might have their drug data with their claims data, with their medical data, and you can add in like their voting record and God knows what else. You can do a lot of stuff. But this particular article, which was by Casey Ross in Stat, picked up this incident where IQVIA had connected GE's data, which was basically EMR data, with another data set they had of claims data. And GE was somewhat concerned about the fact that this was, they felt, pushing the boundaries of what was allowed under HIPAA, but in the end let it go. And my background, I'd love to get you in on Casey and this and Jay on this, but my background is that, number one, we don't know enough about what is going on. And there was an argument back with somebody I was talking on Twitter with about, they said, this is a $70 billion market. I said, no, it isn't. There's no way we're spending $70 billion on data, because they said, well, actually, really, it's $50 billion for advertising and $25 billion for analysis. And I said, even if we are spending $25 billion on health analysis, that there's a bunch of stuff in there that is not the data. But the data itself is worth something, no question. But I mean, there's a whole bunch of, we don't know exactly how much of this data is being combined in these ways. Is it being re-identified, and how, using these tokens? Some cases it definitely is. You can now have companies who will take this de-identified data, match it to your data as a health plan or as a whatever, and then let you re-identify it because you put it through the same token system. That's going on for sure. And then the bit which I'm sure, Casey, you have a lot of things. What the hell is the role of the patient? With Tanya Sweeney, I'll just say that and move on.
Yeah. Anyway, So, Mike, do you want to really quickly pick up and give your
Sure.
give your point in like
Yeah,
a
I
minute?
mean, what can we all agree on? I think we can all agree on the profit motive that
Yeah.
drives investment. I
I'm not
think
sure we
we
don't
can
agree it's a good thing. We agree it exists.
Right.
Oh yeah, it's
think-
definitely there.
Yes, I think we can all agree that the technology to reverse engineer de-identification exists somewhere, and that it has occurred to some extent. We don't know to what extent. I think we can also all agree that there are individual case studies that make one concerned, maybe not so much about you knowing what conditions I specifically as a American have, but things like the emergence of PBMs. How does that occur? How does it remain opaque? How is it legal to kick back to each other? And what kind of data infrastructure would one need in order to accomplish that and plan it and strike the agreements? That would be like one thing.
Right, Mike, can you just explain what's a PPM?
Pharmacy benefit management company.
Oh, sorry, right. Yeah.
PBM.
Okay.
PBM.
PBM. I had PPM and I thought he's getting a new one on.
Or let me give you another example. Okay, it's 2018. We're in Williamstown, West Virginia. There's a population of 3,200. And in 2018, the two drugstores in that little town purchased 21 million pills of OxyContin. Now, putting aside everything else, the question is, what kind of a data system supported the sale from multiple pharmaceutical companies through multiple large clearinghouses, that kind of a sale without any checks and balances, right? No checks and balances. What kind of data infrastructure was at work there? And were there no red flags that came up, or is it more likely there were red flags and people ignored those red flags? So when I think of this problem and this notion of advantaging data and data mining, what pops into my head is my own decade-long experience at Pfizer, where we had very prominent and powerful vice presidents of regional sales in different areas. And there were 5 or 6 of them that covered the United States. And there was one guy at the top. What did that one guy at the top do? He went over the data reports day in and day out. He basically sat and looked at databases. And those databases basically drove the entire sales policy and approach for that company. And that company did extraordinarily well. Now, you know, when I look at this, do I say that's all on the up and up? Everybody follows the rules, nobody bends the rules? Or do I say that even during that period that I was there, they were moving into databases that weren't just Pfizer databases, but now integrated with the databases of the major insurers, of the pharmaceutical, not only the pharmaceutical companies, but the major distributors, not only them, but the CVS who then purchased the insurance company. So the progression during my career of data was toward consolidation, opaqueness, and elimination of checks and balances that allowed for abuse. So I don't have anywhere near the knowledge that you guys do on a granular level of what's happening with this data, but my belief is that likely it has been reverse engineered and that it's been for the purpose of maximizing profitability and minimizing patient benefit
or accountability.
to push consumption.
So
Or
let me jump in on one thing there, right? Because we have, from the other part of our mouths, a lot of us have been saying, well, we don't have great data interoperability. We don't know enough about our patients. If we only knew, I mean, we were just talking about mental health. If we only knew, who actually had diabetes, who was taking drugs, we have the constant problem of people showing up at doctors' offices without great information about what they're doing. You could imagine a world in which, with sweetness and light and candy bears and motherhood and apple pie and baseball, where we use these tools to have, whether it's to link these data sets and do good stuff with them, right? So the obvious one is care management and putting on care. Another one, frequently we know, and Casey, you're in one of these things, clinical trials don't get the right people because people can't find them, and recruiting for them is a real bear. And, and there is somewhere in the middle of all that money being spent now, especially in clinical trial recruitment, which could, Casey and I have had this argument before, some of it could go to the patient for their data, right? And in fact, the sovereignty network is designed, its early stages, to pay the patients some part of their value for their data, even though
it's more of a licensing deal. But anyway, anyway, when you throw it to me, I'll cover the water.
All right. But I mean, what I'm saying is you could imagine that there could be useful ways that this data could be combined, which could be still profitable to somebody, and therefore instead to do without it being bad. But as you didn't, for those on the podcast, you didn't see, Casey was pointing to a phone, obviously, where people are going online and where they're physically going.
If you have one of these, they know everything.
Exactly. So there's a lot of stuff, known about.
I mean, the freaking Stasi, which wishes they'd had these.
Of course. The Stasi would have done much better, and we probably still Eastern Europe would, you see what's going on in China right now.
Hello, yes.
But what I'm saying is that this stuff could be, is technology neutral here, or is it that we're not getting enough transparency into it? And my long plea this morning on Twitter was to say, let's have the people who are doing this at IQVIA and the many other companies involved, if they're doing, let's have them explain what the hell they're doing, and let's not be the opaqueness and the because that naturally is going to lead to the fact that who the hell knows what IQVIA did with that data? Was it for good or for evil? And maybe there's something that can be good out of it, but we don't know because it's hidden behind the scenes. Anyway, I will shut up. Casey, please tell us a little about the sovereignty network and the.
Well, no, I mean, I'm gonna draw a picture that's going
to go off, please.
No, there's going to be several touch points here, including, of course, the Light Collective, of which I am also part.
Yep.
Now, to me, I see this, obviously from a patient's point of view, but I bring a lot else to the party too. But the kick that I've had long with the data economy, and particularly surveillance capitalism, as the data economy has driven itself in that direction, is that there's a whole bunch of, well, not a whole bunch, there's a small group of people that are making, gasping level fortunes because they have learned how to tap what's happening here and make use of it and combine it with other data sets, i.e., IQVIA, et cetera, other, ad targeting stuff, various and sundry data sets that get sucked up by whomever, depending on which level of insurance you're doing, whether it's life, health, or whatever. Anyway, just, life habits, whether or not you're pregnant, because sometimes Target knows before you do. And it's, all of it seems really oppressive to an individual once they wake up to the idea that that's what's going on behind the scenes, in addition to all of this, convenience and seamlessness and frictionlessness and being able to get to care without having to go through 2 weeks waiting for an appointment. Fine. Great. However, all of this, sort of back-end data leakage and lack of accountability has led a bunch of us who have been awake for a while to say, okay, we got to throw a spanner in the works here and say, what are you people doing with this? What's your point? And where is this data going? And I purposefully and provocatively said, okay, you're selling my data, cut me in, bitch. Because, that's what gets somebody's attention. It's not as though I want somebody to pay me 50 cents for my data. No, because, on a single market for just me, that's probably about what it's worth. But now with the Light Collective, we're trying to wake up patient populations, which are actually pretty much awake, about the risks of talking online about your medical conditions and your family's medical conditions without understanding what the platform is and what the real terms of use and what the data use is on those platforms. Now, so that's the Light Collective. And now once you get access and rights and your rights are secured and you are recognized as a person in this value chain, as opposed to just a data unit, then comes, what do you do with all this? You have data. Okay, now what? Well, then, should you wish to, you could get your data into a platform, let's say the Sovereignty Network, which allows you to interact with what they're calling a data coach. You're a data owner as a patient. Then there's data coaches that are available to you who can help put ICD-10, SNOMED, CT, fire code, put all the codes that would be recognizable to medical research and to medical practitioners to all of the things in that data set that you have put into your walled garden here in Sovereignty Network. And then the real power comes when a group of patients with a similar condition or a similar genetic risk or a similar, whatever, pick one. It could be anything and thousands of things. Guess who's going to be looking into metastatic breast cancer? Your girl here. But anyway, you can gather into groups. And then when you get an aggregated group of clinically vetted, coded, a data set of like 1,000 people who have that condition, you have something that could be worth licensing. And I would like to explore that. That's the point. That's sort of the throughput value chain here. Now, the problem is the few people who are making big bucks off of, both the official stuff coming out of EHRs, PBMs, et cetera, and the IQVIA, whatever they're calling themselves this week, all of that, that's, a huge value chain. Then there's all the other value chain stuff that's going on kind of in the dark behind people's backs about, your phone being a snitch. But if we can erase, we'd throw some sunlight on all of this. And I think that we have, if somebody wants to really get their mind blown, I have a pretty clear idea of how we could get to universal basic income globally with this. But I'm going to stop there because I could go on for a week and we've only got 8 minutes left.
So 2 quick points. One is there's a distinction here between what Facebook got up to, which is where the Light Collective and Andrea down.
Well, yeah, but that's one.
Yeah, but worth mentioning, right? So that was people in private, what they thought were private groups, but they were
closed groups at the time.
Closed groups, right? Were Facebook was essentially, by its negligence, allowing other people to come in and download all the information in that group and all the identities of the people, and not just in private health groups. And in fact,
it could be anything.
The one thing that really came out was, something you might say was good investigative journalism, was somebody got into a private group of law enforcement officers in a white supremacist group. To go back to our previous conversation, downloaded all and said, I found this sheriff in Alabama who was a member of the, 3%ers or whatever.
Yeah.
And they had done it using exactly the techniques that Andrea described. And I don't know whether or not it was done in the cancer groups and the sex assault survivor groups or whatever. And Facebook's response was bloody awful, but they also had not prevented that. I mean, it took them for a long time to figure out how to prevent that to happen, and et cetera, et cetera.
Well, that's how lousy.
Which is careless use of non-HIPAA protected, identified but very sensitive information, versus the stuff that Mike talked about is how much is data where they've scrubbed your identifiers, but they can figure out it's Matthew Holt or Casey Quinlan or whomever from activity, right? How many people in Richmond, Virginia had stage 4 metastatic breast cancer, went to this hospital, went to that, how. And then could they link your phone record or God knows what else to it? So that whole thing, to me, is a mess. And I think it's a mess because no one knows what's going on on the outside. There's lack of clarity from the companies who are doing it and raising money and selling stuff. And there's actually very little understanding of what is being sold to whom, for how much, and how big a deal is this anyway?
Yeah,
and all this
exactly.
So
that's the sunlight I want.
Yeah, and I'm with you. And I tweeted out a whole bunch of things that I'd like to know more about. And I don't know if anyone will run with it, or we'll have to do investigative journalism, which is not a forte of mine anyway. I will shut up. I would quick like to go to jail on this. I know we have a couple of minutes. There's a whole industry, and it used to be part of it, jail, of tapping into people's knowledge, Gerson Lehman Group, about what the hell is going on in various things like clinical trials and elsewhere. And there's another data industry around, information there as well, which is not quite the same thing, but is that in some ways connected to this, or is that how do you, because that's other points, right?
Good question. And so, I mean, when I was at GLG, in those, I was there in the early days, the relatively early days. The company is almost 20 years old now. We work with a lot of hedge funds that were looking at healthcare, and those guys were buying all kinds of data. I would say that the primary use case for working with a company like GLG was insight, right? Insight into like, how do you interpret something? So, you may remember this space, this primary research space. There were a couple of marginal players that were trying to actively support insider trading. Like, we weren't in that business, right? Because you could never be a publicly traded company if you did that. And what I saw the smartest hedge funds doing is not saying, hey, doctor, what are the results of this trial? That's stupid, right? You're going to end up in prison that way. But what people used the expert networks to do was look at these data points and help me understand what this stuff means together, right? What do these different points mean? So the way I think the expert networks are probably fitting into this is, again, they're collecting data in places and then figuring out how to get experts to come in and interpret those patterns that they don't understand the significance of those patterns. That's how I think it's ending up.
Do you think there is a connection between the sort of mass data collection, quote unquote, surveillance stuff that's de-identified, de-identification, and the expert networks, or am I just making it up because you're on the show today and you know about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's not something, we never really bought primary data. Like, we didn't buy data, we didn't sell data. We focused on connecting people who needed expertise to the people who had that expertise. So there may be some expert networks that are out there buying data. That wasn't us. What I can say is that if you were to look at SAC Capital or Steve Cohen or any of these big hedge fund guys, Ken, whatever his name is, I'm blocking on his name, but the big hedge fund guys, they are massive customers. They buy all types of data. They probably are using artificial intelligence to pull out, insights from data that people couldn't even really understand. Their level of sophistication is much higher than I think people understand.
But I assume that will that is trickling down to the big pharma guys, the health plans, and people doing marketing, right? I mean, the story about Target figuring out that somebody was, the guy's daughter was pregnant before they'd be based on our other purchases, and and HIPAA is 20 plus years old, and we haven't updated it. And we had Devin McGraw on, who obviously knows more about regulation of this stuff than almost anybody in America, a couple of weeks back. This was immediately after the memo of Roe v. Sorry, the updating what Alita's going to talk about with the abortion law that's going to be coming up. And abortion law and abortion judgment.
It's not an abortion law, it's a decision.
Well, decision, right, that's coming up, correct. And she was saying, by the way, HIPAA protects your data gathered by healthcare institutions and companies. It's not very strong if somebody comes at it with a legal subpoena. And if a state where now abortion is illegal goes to a healthcare provider and says, I want the record on this person I suspect of having had an abortion or being pregnant or whatever, and they're not pregnant. I mean, you could imagine subpoenaing Target because they figured out you're pregnant because you bought whatever, extra candy bars and peanut butter or whatever. I don't know how they did it, but, and then saying, aha, that is XYZ person. Let me go and figure out where the healthcare provider is and, subpoena them. There's not much in the legislation that says that a literally surveillance, state authority can go and find that. And that was a very sobering 5 minutes that Devin lectured us about. And I came out of it going, God, you can imagine this being used in a number of ways. And that's not even going down the path of like what of these identified and re-identified data sets are. I will say, I know we have to.
Rather at its worst.
Yeah. I will say I am semi-involved with a group that is trying to build a kind of very high-tech privacy network where a lot of this stuff, where all the sort of data gets obfuscated one more layer and people are locked in and locked out of stuff, which I will, when I figure out what the hell it is, because I'm struggling to understand it, we'll get involved. But I think there may be some technological ways out of this, and I think some of the stuff that Casey, you and Andrea at the Light Collective have been talking about, maybe that as well. But I still think, if I look at Mike's piece and what I've been talking about is we need a tremendous amount of sunshine and transparency about what the hell is going on here, because otherwise, we might end up with what we have in Europe, right? Which is you can't, basically GDPR is stopping the use of data. They may actually ban Facebook and Google from operating that because of the way they operate. And there should be some good coming out of this. We should be able to get stuff. Anyway.
Yeah,
All
and
right.
I mean that's my goal with everything that I'm doing is to have it be better rather than just turn off the spigot. But at the same time, everyone who contributes should benefit.
Absolutely.
That's my bottom line. Everyone.
All right, we are at the top of the hour, and we've had a thorough conversation. We didn't get back to some of the good stuff. We'll get the next time we're all on. I'm sure we'll get to nuclear winter and the investing climate, but we talked a lot about some really, really pressing concerns. And so with that, I'll quickly go around and say, what are you looking at for the next? What's on your view scope for the next couple of weeks? And why don't I start with you, Mike?
Well, I think we're going to find ourselves reassuring people about monkey virus for the next week or two. And we should be reassured because it's a DNA virus, not an RNA virus, so it doesn't mutate as much. It doesn't transmit as easily. It's not as lethal, and there is a vaccine that hits both smallpox and monkeypox. But I do think you're going to hear more about this rather than less in the next few weeks.
All right. I got very confused. I heard it was sexually transmitted, and I assumed I don't know what people are doing with monkeys, but that's not. I'm sure there are other websites where you can go for that, right? Casey.
Well, I'll be continuing to watch for this, nuclear winter or whatever, and riding with my, head thinking of Cory Doctorow referring to, sort of the digital health bonanza and SPACs in particular in digital health as the lucky dip on Carney Row.
JL, you should give yourself a 12. I know we've talked about Casey's podcast and I mentioned yours. Give yourself a 12-second plug for your podcast and how that works. It's getting very interesting. And let me know what else you're up to.
Sure. So thank you, Matthew. So the podcast is called Is It Serious? We're doing this with, we are produced by the Offscript Health. So that's Matthew Zachary, the former head of Stupid Cancer. And it's me and my broadcasting partner, a guy named Mark Lewis, who is a GI oncologist in Salt Lake City. And
allegedly Scottish, he claims, although I don't see
he is Scottish, and he came to the United States, I think, when he said he was 12 years old. But in any case, Mark and I every week talk about an interesting healthcare topic or healthcare issue. We actually talked about Uvalde yesterday. We've talked about medical errors recently. We talked about sleep. And, we are heavily influenced by Anthony Bourdain and Kitchen Confidential. And our goal is to lift the veil and talk a little bit about what really goes on behind the scenes in healthcare. Also a little influenced by Car Talk and Click and Clack as well. So that's my podcast. And then in terms of what I'm looking forward to, you guys may remember that about 2 weeks ago, Biden finally got through his candidate for the Federal Trade Commission, a guy named Alvaro Bedoya. He is an attorney and an academic at Georgetown. And now we finally have a fully staffed Federal Trade Commission. And I'm very interested in the Federal Trade Commission's approach to concentration in the healthcare industry, and what the Biden administration is going to be doing to tackle consolidation and all of the sort of second order effects that come out of consolidation in the healthcare space.
Yeah, something that Ian Morrison on a lecture he gave referred to as alphabetical concentration, because you have Advocate Aurora buying HM to become the largest health system in multiple places. Should be fascinating. All right. That is about that from a great hour on THCB Gang. I want to thank my guest, Casey Quinlan from Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy, JL Neptune from New York City, and Mike Magee from Connecticut. We'll be back with episode 94 early, I can't do the math, so early June. It'll be June the 4th, I believe, next week. I'm Matthew Holt, the founder and publisher of THCB, saying thanks for listening on the podcast. Thanks for watching live or catching up on this later. Look forward to seeing you all soon, and appreciate everybody listening. And we'll be back with another round in a week's time.